Liberty in our lifetimes in a free state of our own. That's the vision. That's the dream. And we are building it in New Hampshire. I'm Eric Brakey, your host and renegade statesman for the Porcupine Report. Welcome to your source for porcupine news and free-range conversation on matters of liberty. All right, let's hop into the show. Well, all right. There. It'll hang out there. Hi, Elliot. So I was really struggling to figure out what I was going to talk about here today. A lot of people, obviously as the new incoming executive director of the Free State Project, a lot of people have a lot of questions about who the hell is this guy? Why did they pull in someone to lead the Free State Project who doesn't even live in New Hampshire yet? And a lot of people have been asking me questions about some of the stories in terms of how I got on this road, how I came to be here. And I thought today would be a good opportunity to talk about some stories I haven't talked about in a fairly long time that have all led me to the final conclusion for me at this moment that the Ron Paul revolution is alive. It is alive across this country, and where it lives more than anywhere else is here in New Hampshire. So I was up till 4:30 in the morning preparing some written remarks, so hopefully I don't seem a little exhausted, but I wanted to get everything right on paper because there's a lot of history here and some stories I want to share with you, and some of these stories include some notable individuals who are even here in the room with us today, who I'll acknowledge as we go on. So, how did it all get started? Well, in 2010, I joined the Ron Paul Revolution. I remember the moment it came to me like an epiphany that we had all been lied to, and that I had myself, as a young and stupid teenager, promoted a lot of those lies. I came of age under the presidency of George W. Bush, which some of us who are old enough can remember. In our house, Rush Limbaugh was on the radio and Bill O'Reilly was on the TV, the latter telling us nightly, "Don't be a pinhead by questioning the war machine." That would make you a pinhead if you asked any questions about why we were invading all these countries all across the world. And after the 9/11 attacks, which to us average Americans seemed to come from nowhere, like we were just here minding our own business, and what in the world could anyone in the Middle East, how could they have any problem with us? What did we ever do, right? The 90s were just great. It was a wonderful time. It was a party in America. And we thought we were just minding our own business, but our government was up to things that we weren't always fully aware of. Well, Toby Keith told us to put a boot up their ass because that's the American way. And our president, who had campaigned just a year earlier on a humble foreign policy, took the great leap forward to transform our government into an imperial national security state. And the worst part of it is that I cheered it on at the time. As a teenager, I didn't know any better. I cheered on the invasion of Afghanistan and then the invasion of Iraq. I cheered on the passage of the Patriot Act and the destruction of our civil liberties. And when people dissented from the war, I cheered as the CDs of the Dixie Chicks were smashed in the streets. And I even put a Boycott France bumper sticker on the back of my first car. Why? Because Bill O'Reilly told me to. That's where I was. And when that doctor and congressman from Texas ran for president in 2008, I parroted the lines programmed into me by the people on the telescreens. What a joke! No one takes him seriously. After all, he's anti-American. And when he told Rudy Giuliani to read a few books about the reasons we were attacked on 9/11, because our government in Washington, D.C. was in the Middle East, bombing countries, propping up dictators, and starving children to death, I was right on cue with everyone else. How dare he blame America? They attacked us for our freedom, right? That's why we had to rename the French fries to freedom fries to show that we meant business. But by the end of the primary season, for those who remember that election in 2008, among the Republican candidates, the media told us it was down to 3 candidates we could consider. The maverick, John McCain. He was so mavericky. The strong, stalwart conservative from Massachusetts, Mitt Romney. And if you were a real radical, you were really on the edge, you were really challenging the status quo, there was the ultra-conservative Mike Huckabee. That was who we were allowed to choose from. And so I voted in the 2008 Ohio Republican primary within that 3x5 card of allowable public opinion for Mike Huckabee. And I felt like a real rebel doing it. When Frank Luntz arrived at my college campus to poll students, I actually appeared on Fox News, and thankfully I've never found this clip because I would be so embarrassed of it today. I was saying, I was voting for Mike Huckabee, but you know what? I was excited to support in November the presumptive Republican nominee, John McCain. That Hawk's hawk who never saw a country he didn't want to bomb and fancied himself clever for singing a parody song about launching another Middle East regime change war with bombs incinerating more babies and civilians to the tune of Barbara Ann. Bomb, 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 Iran. And I even voted for him in November. I look back on that and I think about how I was living inside of a matrix, right? I think we all kind of try to find different words. We often turn to pop culture for how do we describe this phenomenon of people who can't see the reality that's right in front of them. And it's a pretty good metaphor. I was living in the matrix, under the spell of artificial narratives, and I couldn't see anything wrong with it. The red team was good, and Barack Obama was a socialist. At least the second part was true. It wasn't until the Tea Party took off that I could even imagine any dissent from the Republican Party orthodoxy. Watching Glenn Beck, I know there's many criticisms fairly to make about Glenn Beck, but he was a bit of a gateway drug for me, and I've heard some other libertarians along the way who he was for as well. Every 5 o'clock in the living room in the house I was sharing with other students at Ohio University, I was tuning in to the Glenn Beck show. A cynic might say it was an attempt, that program, to co-opt the liberty populism of the Tea Party, which of course we know began with the Tea Party fundraising money bombs of the Ron Paul campaign in 2008. But that's not the effect it had on me. Suddenly, it seemed that being a conservative stopped centering so much on support for Bush-era wars, which had, of course, become Obama-era wars. Maybe that making it a little bit easier for conservatives to start thinking a little differently there. But rhetorical support for the U.S. Constitution as the basis for opposition to socialized medicine and banker bailouts seemed to be the new focus of what it meant to be a conservative. And Glenn Beck even praised that doctor from Texas on occasion, saying he was the most honest man in Congress. Well, I thought, boy, if Glenn Beck is saying that, maybe... he still thought he was wrong on all the foreign policy and all the wars, but boy, if he could say that this guy was the most honest man in Congress, then maybe I had judged something a little bit wrong. Maybe there was something there worth looking at. So my brother sent me a book. I had a brother, an older brother. I still have an older brother. He's still around, right? When I was a George W. Bush supporter, rah, the wars, I will say he was the first Ron Paul supporter in our family, and I'll tell you, he wasn't always very nice about it. He would say to me, Eric, you really think that they just attacked us because they hate us for our freedom? That they heard Britney Spears, was not wearing a burqa and they decided to come over halfway across the world and attack us? He would mock me, he would ridicule me, and of course, I was wrong and he was right, but that wasn't the most effective way to get me to change my mind. It caused me to dig my heels in a little bit. But he sent me a book. I have the very copy of the book right here. Ron Paul's The Revolution, a Manifesto. In retrospect, I'm sure some folks have a copy of this book. I've always thought it was very interesting to look at this book versus the books put out by all other presidential candidates I've ever seen. What's the number one thing you see on the cover of books by presidential candidates? You see their face, right? You see Hillary Clinton's face on whatever book she wrote about, anyway, Mitt Romney, John, it's always like their face. It's about them. Where do you find Ron Paul's face? You got to turn to the back of the book, right? Because this wasn't about him. It was about ideas. It wasn't about how great he was. It was about how great the ideas that he was carrying were. Ideas that have been passed on from generation to generation since the American founding, from Thomas Jefferson, this torch of liberty being passed down from so many. And in that moment, Ron Paul was carrying that torch and carrying those ideas. So I actually read it. I came to the conclusion that I agreed with him on everything except for one major thing. We can all guess what it was. I'm sure many of us who were involved in those days heard it from conservatives all the time. I agree with him on everything except for foreign policy, right? He was right that the government had grown too large. He was right that we needed to cut spending in a serious way to stop the growth of the $14 trillion debt. $14 trillion, wow, right? It seems comical these days. It's tripled in size since then. It seemed that he was on to something when he wrote about the Federal Reserve and the threat of inflation. I could even begin to see where he was coming, though it was a little hard for me to get over certain things that had been programmed into me, but I could start to see where he was coming on the war on drugs and recognizing that perhaps a lot of the policies that had been put in place to crack down on drug abuse were maybe in fact making drug abuse worse and maybe weren't helping the problem at all. But on the foreign wars, like so many conservatives at the time, my mind remained very closed. I had bought in too much. I had internalized this war fever into my identity and my sense of self as I yelled at my liberal friends in high school and college who told me Bush lied, people died, and I would get angry and I would regurgitate the talking points I heard without understanding from Sean Hannity and Bill O'Reilly, and I just doubled down and I dug my heels in, and it had become, very unhealthy, actually. I passionately defended these wars for years, and those propaganda slogans, I couldn't let go of them. But I think that I must have known on some level there was a bit of cognitive dissonance building for me, that something was really wrong here, and I couldn't quite admit it to myself. But then two things happened. First, that brother who sent me the book, he kept sending me these YouTube videos by a guy named, now some people might know him, some people might not. He was actually here at PorcFest for the first time this year, and he gave a great speech on Tuesday. His name is Jack Hunter. And he kept sending me videos, YouTube videos by this guy. And what Jack Hunter was great at was talking to conservatives and really talking to conservatives on their values, where they are, and saying, if these are really our values, shouldn't we be conserving liberty? Isn't that what we should be concerned about? Our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, the ideas are all there. Isn't that what it means to be an American conservative? And I will always remember, because it was one question that just got stuck in my head and just rolled around there for a long time. I kept trying to wrestle with it. In one of these videos, he asked conservatives, if we all agree that the Federal Department of Education is a wasteful and counterproductive government bureaucracy, then where is the magical fairy dust we sprinkle over the Department of Defense to make it anything different? Where is that magical fairy dust? Don't we as conservatives know that government is terrible, wasteful, and incompetent? Why, when it comes to the military, should we expect anything different? So that question stuck with me. It kept rolling around in my head until a particular week of the Glenn Beck program, in which he devoted to areas to cut spending in the federal government. Now, the first couple of things were things you would expect on a conservative TV, show. I don't even remember what they were. I'm sure it was like the Department of Education. Maybe it was complaining about NPR, right? Because if we cut funding for NPR, that's going to balance the budget. I mean, we should do it, right? They shouldn't get a dime from us, but certainly this nibbling around the edges things is very serious. But I always remember, and I think it was the Thursday that week, Glenn Beck did an episode on. He said, we've got to put all the sacred cows on the table if we want to balance the budget and get spending under control. So let's talk about the Department of Defense. And I don't even remember what it was said. I mean, I imagine it was probably some very mild critique. It was something in the range of, we have to admit that not every dollar used on the military is well spent. Something, maybe a conservative can kind of open their mind to a little bit. But whatever it was, whatever he said was besides the point. In that moment, it was like the door of a mental prison that I had been trapped in without realizing it for so many years. It's like it swung open. I could suddenly see things that I couldn't see before. All of the arguments that I had been reading and hearing and rejecting suddenly clicked into place because that Tea Party conservative TV pundit host gave me permission to ask questions. Sometimes I talk about that, and I think kind of how sad it is to realize that I needed permission from someone else to ask questions. But I will say, I think as time has gone on, I realize that there are a lot of people who still find themselves in that mental prison. I think we only need to look around at what happened in our country during COVID to realize that a lot of people are still living in mental prisons, afraid to ask questions until someone in authority tells them it's okay to ask questions, right? Did that come from a lab? You can't ask that question. The people in authority say that's a conspiracy theory, right? We've all seen that. So for me, back in 2010, once I found that permission to see what was right in front of me, instantaneously I realized I joined the Ron Paul revolution. Realization that the doctor from Texas, Congressman Ron Paul, was right, or that the ruling establishment had lied to us. It was the realization that the people in power, and the neoconservatives in particular, had preyed upon our virtues. This is the thing that made me the most angry when I realized it. They didn't just lie to us. They preyed upon our patriotism. They preyed upon our compassion for other people, our love of freedom, in order to convince us to go halfway across the world and commit great evils against people who never harmed us, resulting in the deaths by some estimates of millions of people. That's what they did. And they preyed upon good people to get them to support it. But what the hell could I do about it? I was a college student at Ohio University. I was about to graduate with a BFA in theater. I didn't know what I could do about it. But I did start reading a lot of new kinds of books. And with a BFA diploma in my hand, I moved to New York City to become an actor, riding the subways back and forth to auditions, rehearsals, and various temp jobs. And that gave me a lot of time for reading. Back on the subways of those days, you didn't have any cell phone service, right? You were underground. So what could you do but read books? One day, actually, an objectivist caught me on the A train. I was reading Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Now, I don't remember this guy's name. One of many kind of liberty supporters out there in the world that had an impact on me, and I'll never know who he was. But we had a good talk about the book before one of us got off at the right stop, and he asked me if I'd read any Ayn Rand. So I read Atlas Shrugged, and it was taken in as I was riding the trains, literally reading this great long book about trains of all things. And I was taken in by her defense of capitalism and her condemnation of the looter class, which had recently made itself apparent in our society with the massive banker bailouts. And then I read Bastiat and Hazlitt and Rothbard. And after 17 years of public education, I was finally receiving the best education of my life, riding back and forth on the New York subway system, reading things I actually wanted to read and not things that were assigned to me by some teacher or professor. I mean, I don't mean to hate on my teachers and professors. I had some great ones, but it was really when I became a self-directed learner, reading the things that I cared about, it was profound. And eventually I discovered the New York City Liberty crowd, and that's when I became an activist, not just a person who agreed with the ideas, but the person who said, I'm finding ways to try to make a difference. It was there that I met someone who's still a very good friend of mine today, a man named Michael Moresco. We actually, the other night, we watched a documentary in this very room about him and some of the folks on the Ron Paul campaign in 2008. He walked and biked thousands of miles across America in the 2008 campaign, spreading the message of freedom and telling people about Ron Paul's campaign for president. I also met Nick Spanos, a big Greek real estate force in Lower Manhattan, who donated an unfinished loft in Soho as a base of operations for liberty activism. And once Ron Paul announced his 2012 campaign, we tabled in Union Square, we held debate watch parties, we began early phone banking, we even ran pub crawls spreading the word of Ron Paul's plan to end the tax on tips. Actually, I just recently heard a recent presidential candidate coming back with that, and he's like, I had this great original idea with no tax on tips. And I'm glad he's running with the idea, but I know that was Ron Paul. He should take some more ideas from him, by the way. And the mantra at the time was, while the 2008 campaign was abundant with diffused grassroots enthusiasm that often ran off in a million different directions, for the 2012 campaign, we were going to be focused, and we were going to make sure that grassroots energy was channeled into effective tactics that actually would work to make Ron Paul the next president of the United States. That was what we honestly believed we could do. That is what we honestly set out to fight for. And I will tell you, we can all look back at history and see how things played out, but at the time, it seemed actually achievable. And going to the 2011 Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington, D.C., this is the first time that I met a bunch of other young Ron Paul supporters from all across the country, thousands of young liberty activists arriving to win the straw poll for Dr. Paul. And while we were there, we also happened to do some other things I really enjoyed. We booed the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, when CPAC gave him a Defender of Freedom Award. A huge insult to freedom itself. Given him by Dick Cheney. Are you kidding me? Darth Vader? Darth Vader goes to pin on one of his admirals. Congratulations on standing up for freedom. And we even booed, at the time, Donald Trump, when he, flirting with a campaign for president that year, told us, Ron Paul can't win. No. So we booed Donald Trump back then because we believed, screw him. Our movement was more focused and professional than ever. It was growing by leaps and bounds, and we were doing what we could to win and to restore America now. Now, at that CPAC, I'll always remember there was this assembly of liberty supporters, and the night before the straw poll vote, there were two rookie members of Congress who had just gotten elected and joined Ron Paul on stage to speak with supporters. After winning these elections for the first time in Michigan and Kentucky, the freshly minted Congressman Justin Amash and Senator Rand Paul were there with optimism about this new wave, this libertarian moment that seemed to be upon us. And of course, the faction supporting Romney said, we were in a cult of Ron Paul. Well, while we were listening to our liberty heroes in our room of where all the liberty opponents were gathered, the irony, of course, was that they were gathered in another room for a celebration of Ronald Reagan. And get this, there was a cake with Ronald Reagan's face on it, right? And they were eating the cake with Ronald Reagan's face on it and saying, those people are in a cult. And, I distinctly remember a young guy in that room who I didn't know at the time. I didn't know his name. I met him many years later through at grassroots activism efforts. He's a guy named John. He's actually here with us right now. And he stood up to say, they say we're in a cult, but they're literally in another room eating a cake, eating Ronald Reagan in effigy. They're having this, imagine like other people calling you cultish while they're unthinkingly engaging in this weird Republican like communion ritual, right? Eating the face of their dead like zombie Ronald Reagan in effigy, right? And the next day, we were proud. Ron Paul won that straw poll, showing that the activist youth of the Republican Party was behind him. And beside that, I will also say I always really appreciated meeting him for the very first time, Tom Woods, the great Dr. Tom Woods, and getting his signature on my copy of Nullification, which he had just published and has been a great manual for, I think every state legislator should read it. It was a manual to swear by during my time in the legislature. But even more than meeting Tom and seeing Ron win, the greatest victory I felt there was seeing that the line for people to get their books signed by Tom Woods was infinitely larger than the line for people to get Donald Rumsfeld to sign his book. It's like maybe 5 people over there while people were all... For Tom Woods, not even for Ron Paul, right? I mean, this was the guy who just got the Defender of the Freedom Award, right? People didn't seem to be that interested. So, back in New York, our group, we called it the NYC Liberty HQ. We organized a rally for Ron Paul at Webster Hall. It was the biggest nightclub in Manhattan, and we packed it and pulled in huge media coverage for the good doctor. And after that, I noticed that some of our best activists, like, just started disappearing. The campaign hired one volunteer to go to work the Iowa straw poll. Another colleague became the deputy press secretary, and when that big Greek guy I was telling you about, Nick Spanos, told me I should apply for a job with the Ron Paul campaign, I'll tell you, it wasn't part of my plans. I had like a 10-year plan, right? I'd spent 10 years like trying to become a professional actor. I was finally in New York City. I was finally starting to have some success, and it was like, you should go leave and join the Ron Paul campaign, and that just wasn't what I'd been working for 10 years. This was like something I was doing on the side. But you know what? Eventually, as I thought it over, I realized that we were at an inflection point in history, right? Something important, something big was happening in our country. And I said, all right, I'll put this aside. I'll put my first love in the theater aside for now, just for a year, just for now. And I'll go apply and join the Ron Paul campaign. After all, I can return once the campaign is over. All right? It didn't happen. I went to Maine. My family roots are there, though I was not raised there, but my parents, my mom's family's been there for 10 generations. And there were 3 of us to staff the entire state. But we connected with grassroots movements of thousands of people, including my good friend who's in the back right here, Brent Tweed, who's a pork ranger this year and left us in Maine to join the Free State Project several years back, which was something was a great loss for Maine, but a great pickup for New Hampshire. But Brent had been an activist in the 2008 campaign and like literally kept the Ron Paul movement in Maine going, like with meetups over the course of the 4-year interim. And with that network, we built a statewide grassroots system of county and local coordinators holding local meetings, identifying local supporters, and making sure people turned out to caucus for Ron Paul. And on the big final day of the caucuses, after months and months of really hard work and organizing, it was, pardon my French, it was total fucking chaos. The race in Maine had really come down to Ron Paul versus Mitt Romney. And after a disappointing 3rd place in Iowa, now it was 3rd place by just like, man, they were all like within 1 point of each other. At one point, it really looked like Ron was going to win Iowa. And then Sean Hannity did a hit piece on him. But after that 3rd place in Iowa, even though he would go on to win the delegates, and a strong 2nd place in New Hampshire, because New Hampshire came out strong for Ron Paul that year, Maine seemed like the one state poised to give Ron Paul a 1st place finish. In fact, I remember when the media asked Dr. Paul why he was skipping the Florida primary, he told them, you know what? I'm focused on Maine. And unlike New Hampshire, we didn't usually see presidential candidates in our state for our nominating processes, but both Ron Paul and Mitt Romney came in person to make personal appeals on the final day of those caucuses. And I'll say our supporters showed up in record numbers. Caucuses had never seen turnouts like these. We told them the priority was to get elected as delegates to the state convention. And usually in the Maine caucuses, there are more delegate spots than people who want to go. So basically all you have to do is raise your hand and you get to be a delegate. That's not what happened this year. These caucuses saw more people than ever, and suddenly party stalwarts, people who'd been just like the people who show up to the GOP meetings every single month, even if those GOP meetings don't actually accomplish anything, right? They're often just social clubs, right? But they were entitled to delegate seats, and they were losing these delegate seats to Ron Paul supporters who just showed up out of nowhere, just showed up. No-name people were showing up and taking delegate seats that they were entitled to, or they felt entitled to. And boy, it did create a lot of conflict and a lot of ill will. But we, as Ron Paul folks, we came and we planted our flag, and we won massive delegates to that state convention. But of course, we also wanted, for the sake of public momentum, there was this thing, this beauty contest preference poll. It was a non-binding thing, but people show up at the caucus and they cast a ballot for who their preference is for president, and it's a beauty contest that the media reports on. And though it doesn't have any actual effect on the delegates, which is what really counts, the media says, so-and-so won the Maine caucus because they won this preference poll. That doesn't actually matter in terms of the rules. And but we really wanted to win that. We needed that momentum. And things got weird. Full towns had their numbers misreported. An entire county where Dr. Paul was very strong, Washington County, they canceled their caucus that day on account of snow. I mean, Maine's a lot like New Hampshire. I think we're pretty used to snow. We know how to deal with it. Oh, they canceled it, right? They disenfranchised everyone there to participate in that preference poll. And in the end, the GOP party chair declared, by a margin of 200 votes, Mitt Romney the winner of the Maine caucus preference poll. And I'll tell you, in that room that night, we were all pissed. We were all pissed. It was a sad night. I remember standing there on stage behind Dr. Paul when he gave his remarks. Felt like the wind had just been sucked out of the room. We all really wanted that big victory for him. And I don't really remember exactly what Ron Paul said that night, but I remember after he spoke, a smile appeared on his face. And he reached down, he grabbed a balloon off the stage, and he just playfully just threw it into the audience. And then he just started kicking and throwing balloons and laughing, and he just got everyone's spirits up. And it was just like Ron was saying, we're going to keep moving forward. And while all this was happening, of course, there was a chorus of cheers of President Paul. Well, after that, the two other staffers, Ryan and David in Maine, they shipped off to Missouri for caucuses, and I was left behind in Maine. My boss, though, had petitioned the national campaign to keep me there to try to see things through and help delegates prepare for the state convention. We only had a few months, and I didn't really know what I was doing, to be honest. I mean, I was 23 years old at the time. I was a very young man. And but I was wise enough. I pulled together a team of grassroots leaders from across the state, and we started planning our convention strategy. But at the same time, however, I noticed that because we're libertarians and we all do our own thing, I noticed that there were another group of Paul delegates in another part of the state that had started organizing their own strategy conference calls. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be a disaster. If we fracture now, if we go into this state convention with fractured strategies and without a unified front, we are not going to be able to deliver victory for Dr. Paul. And we would be unable to pull off the coup that we ultimately did pull off, which they ended up calling the greatest coup in recent Maine history. For those who remember the days of the Ron Paul Revolution, there was often tension and distrust between the official campaign and the grassroots. In a system of spontaneous order, everyone has their own ideas on how best to pursue their goals. Certainly in the Free State Movement, we certainly know that, right? And the campaign wanted to focus on the meat and vegetables of winning elections, making phone calls for voter identification and turnout. You know, there was a call center right here in New Hampshire that was infamous for how many calls were being churned out by volunteers with a very clear purpose. And in fact, that was led by that Greek guy, Nick Spanos, who pushed me into the job. He came up to New Hampshire to help with the phone calls for Ron Paul. But, you know, a lot of grassroots folks were still focused on plastering the world with yard signs, crowdfunding for their own literature, including an infamous super brochure that many people thought was kind of counterproductive. And spending effort and money on activities that didn't always translate into votes at the polls. But you know what? That's what grassroots are about. And in some ways, that's what made the Ron Paul campaign magical. And, oh yeah, the 2008 blimp. That was before my time, but that was one thing that was certainly magical. Now, in my position, look, I couldn't fault the delegates organizing an alternate convention strategy. So just because I was the state director of the official campaign didn't mean anyone was obligated to like follow my strategy and like what I thought. Like, we're all radical individualists. We're all libertarians. We do what we think is best. We make our own decisions. You know, they wanted to be proactive, and I realized that I had to more broadly include people in the preparations that we were putting together. We had to have some radical communication, some radical collaboration, some radical transparency. So I held my own weekly calls. We opened to all the identified Ron Paul delegates. We visited every county holding convention trainings. And, you know, people say that organizing libertarians is a lot like herding cats, right? We hear that a lot. I found the secret is don't try to herd libertarians. You're not going to. You can't herd cats. You can't herd libertarians. So instead, don't try it. I laid out the plan. I invited people to participate. And we built a united front together for what newspapers did eventually call the greatest political coup in recent Maine history. As the convention approached, we continued identifying delegates through phone banking. We saw the numbers were close, so we went for everything. I took applications for national delegate. I have interviewed every candidate personally and put together a slate representing leaders from every county in the state. And that wasn't all. After the long clash with our party establishment, who called us wingnuts, by the way, and the repeated behavior of party establishments across the country disrespecting, disenfranchising the Ron Paul supporters in their state, we decided, with full slates of vetted candidates, we went after every single thing in the party that was not nailed down. On the first day, Paul delegates executed the first stage of our strategy. It was a simple one. Wake up early and be in line at 5 a.m. The convention probably didn't open until like 8 or 9, right? So we had people standing out there 3 hours ahead of time at the Augusta Civic Center to ensure we received our credentials first, because we worried the establishment's pick for convention chair would railroad us. So we decided we were doing something you just don't do. We decided we were going to run our own candidate for chairman of the Maine Republican Party Convention, a Ron Paul supporter. His name was Brent Tweed. He's sitting back there, right? We came to affectionately call him Boss Tweed, the man who taught me everything about parliamentary procedure. And since we were seated first, of course, though, we were worried if they were seated first, they would just go ahead and run the vote without us. But of course, because we were seated first, they made it sure that every single person was fully credentialed before they ran the vote. But when the establishment pick for convention secretary lost unexpectedly by several dozen votes to a Paul delegate, a panic set in amongst our opponents. They whipped every supporter they had, chatting out in the halls to be present for the next vote for convention chair. And in the end, after hours of hand counting and disbelief, out of 2,000 delegates present, Brent Tweed won the chairmanship by 4 votes. 4 votes. If a single family hadn't shown up that day, history would have been different. The man, as I said, the man who taught me parliamentary procedure now had the gavel. And we learned how quickly we studied and understood the rules better than our opponents when the whole convention descended into chaos. Well, I led the convention strategy from the floor for the Ron Paul delegates, wearing this nice hat that we had to all of our organizers on the floor wearing. On the other side, for Mitt Romney, was a guy named Ben Ginsberg. He's an infamous attorney, a parliamentarian, and a power player for the national GOP establishment. And he remains my very favorite political scalps I keep on my wall. His job was to ensure Ron Paul did not win the convention, seemingly by any means necessary. They attempted every parliamentary trick in the book, but in our convention trainings, we had planned for every trick they had. Fake slates, dilatory motions, telling their own people to go home to deny the presence of a quorum. Brent had the gavel, I had the floor, and we countered everything they threw at us with the premeditated knowledge of the rules. But the one tactic that nearly stopped us, that nearly beat us, however, didn't take place on the floor. It took place in the back rooms where nobody could see. Every time we voted by ballot, the Romney team delayed the results by demanding repeated and numerous recounts. They effectively brought the convention to a standstill, attempting to run out the clock and prevent our majority from conducting business. On the first day we had won every at-large national delegate seat. It was amazing to see. A bunch of no-name first-timers defeated the Republican Secretary of State and well-known elected officials. But nothing counted officially until the results were announced to the full convention and recorded in the minutes, so they fought to make sure that never happened. With their recounts, the Romney campaign kept us stuck in a district convention for almost the entirety of the second day. Ultimately, we saw their tactic and we countered. Since they had told their delegates to go home, we realized something. We had supermajorities at the convention. We had over 2/3 support there. And you know what? When you have a supermajority, you can do some very interesting things, like suspending the rules, which we did. And you know what? We suspended the rules to say, all these things that the rules say have to be done by ballot, where we know that this is the bottleneck that they're using to try to bring this convention to a standstill. We just said, we're going to make a motion to suspend the rules and do them by a show of hands. Every single one of them. And in record time, we took everything. We took everything. Their strategy collapsed. We took the delegates. We took majorities on the GOP state committee. We took both RNC seats, even electing the youngest member ever, a 21-year-old Irish Spitfire named Ashley Ryan. She's awesome, if anyone knows her out there. To this day, everyone who was there still talks about the 2012 Maine Republican Convention. And you ask anyone here at PorcFest who was there, they'll tell you about it too. Now, keep in mind, however, I was only 23 years old. My plan had been to go back to work in the theater, but I found myself in a very peculiar position at the age of 23 of having taken over my entire state's Republican Party, right? So whatever plans I had at this point, my life seemed somewhat committed on a different path, and all by a margin of 4 votes. There was no turning back there. Now, that summer actually was my first PorcFest. I came for a few days. Yeah, we can applaud PorcFest. That was like the year of Ron Paul at PorcFest. Everyone was excited about the Ron Paul revolution. I'll tell you, though, I was terribly unprepared. I didn't have a campsite. I actually slept very uncomfortably in my car, parked over like in the fields back there. Maybe you're not supposed to do that, but that's what I did. I did pay for my car to be here on site, though, right? Like $5 a day, right? But I remember meeting the folks from Free Talk Live, and I speaking on their program about what just happened with the convention takeover in Maine. It was a strange moment to suddenly feel like I'd become this like minor libertarian folk hero. And when you're a folk hero, you don't want to let the folks down, so you keep going. But I'll tell you, I was internally somewhat conflicted a little bit. I remember that same year. Again, I was 23 years old. Looking back on it, I was really just a kid. I had a friend, Lauren, actually John's sister. She was only a few years younger than me, and I remember that summer she went off to be a camp counselor. Could just leave for several months to go do something fun like be a camp counselor. And a sad thought hit me that's kind of funny to think about now. It was like a realization that my millennial childhood was over, and I thought, I'll never be a camp counselor. I'll never get to do that. Well, I'm getting to that, Carla. But I thought that part of my life with the freedom to run off and try new things, it was kind of like over. People were looking at me suddenly to lead, and we were up against forces larger than I could possibly comprehend at that age. And real or imagine, I felt this responsibility that really felt bigger than what I was ready for. And today, sometimes I wish I could go back and tell that kid to, just stop being so dramatic. Look, here it is. Look, after 12 long years, 3 terms in the state Senate, 2 federal campaigns, the election of, bizarrely, President Donald Trump, a totalitarian pandemic, an additional $20 trillion in debt, a new Cold War with Russia with nuclear weapons pointed at us, you will finally get to be a libertarian camp counselor at PorcFest. So the story has a happy ending. But in the summer of 2012, from down on high, word came down that the Mitt Romney campaign was challenging our delegation to the National Convention in Tampa, Florida. They claimed our victory was illegitimate. After all, the argument went, Mitt Romney had won the beauty contest, the non-binding preference poll, so it wasn't right that Maine could send unbound delegates to go and vote for the person they thought was the best candidate, Dr. Ron Paul. However flimsy their argument was, however, the Romney campaign, representing the presumptive Republican nominee, had effectively merged with the RNC at that point in time, so we fought the challenge but quickly realized that our prosecutor was also the judge and the jury. Talk about a rigged system. Now, they tried offering us deals. If we pledged to vote for Mitt Romney, they would let us keep our delegate spots. But fuck that. We wanted to vote for Ron Paul. Delegate spots mean nothing. We want to just go to some Republican party just to hobnob and eat fancy food or something? That's not why we were there. That's not why grassroots people helped us raise thousands of dollars for plane tickets and hotel rooms to be there at that convention. They expected us to go and vote for the person we said we were going to vote for, and that was Ron Paul. And so the delegation was pretty adamant we weren't taking any deals. Now, our governor, Paul LePage, who, it was a controversial decision at the time for some, but we had wisely added him to our slate of delegates, even though he was supporting Mitt Romney. I guess he returned the favor by threatening to boycott the National Convention if they touched the Maine delegates who were elected. And maybe perhaps fearing that, thinking they could somehow get around it, they decided to split the baby. There were 20 Paul delegates in a convention of 24. Arbitrarily, they disqualified half of us, including me, giving us the insult of guest passes to sit in the bleachers while people who weren't elected sat in our seats. The rules required a candidate to have majorities in 5 states to have their name entered into nomination and deliver an uncensored speech on primetime TV. And without Maine, Ron Paul had now just 4 states. They did not want him to speak. They were afraid of it. So our governor boycotted, our delegation revolted, and Remember the Maine became the rallying cry for the entire Ron Paul revolution across America. Not only did they take our credentials away from elected delegates, handing them out to hand-picked Mitt Romney supporters elected by no one and selected by an RNC committee with not even a single person from our state. My old nemesis, Ben Ginsburg, led a rule change to strip away the right of state parties to send unbound delegates ever again. They didn't want a repeat of what happened in Maine. If the state conducted any kind of presidential preference poll, it was called, they have to be bound. It was called the Ginsburg Power Grab, and the great Morton Blackwell of Virginia, founder of the Leadership Institute, led the opposition alongside a broad coalition of conservative and libertarian national delegates to stop it. But on the day of the vote of the Rules Committee, when they were dealing with the Ginsburg Power Grab, something really funny happened. The bus for the Virginia delegation got lost. Now, these buses were operated by the RNC. It was taking them to the delegation and somehow got going around, driving around in circles around Tampa. And Morton Blackwell's calling the police. I've been kidnapped. They've got me on a bus. They won't let me. I don't know what they must have thought about. It was like some crazy old guy complaining about being on a bus, right? But the day of the vote of the Rules Committee, he wasn't there. They kidnapped him. And the former governor of New Hampshire, John Sununu, chaired that rules committee. Those who were present tell me that he and Ben Ginsburg rammed through those rule changes. With Blackwell absent, our opposition leader was sidelined. Maine had well, you know what? I'm going to have to skip ahead a little bit because I'm passionate about this, but we're running out of time, right? I appreciate all you intently listening. Look, I'll skip ahead a little bit. At the end of it, people fought on the floor to seat the Maine delegates, to fight the rule power grab. And you know what? Actually, after we were going to like hotel rooms, slipping stuff under doors, letting delegates know, and of course getting kicked out of those hotels when people figured out what we were up to, trying to alert delegates about it. When the votes came on the floor for the credentials report and the rules report, first it was the credentials report to seat the Maine delegates. All in favor of adopting the credentials report say aye, all opposed nay, right? It was really actually hard to hear which was louder than the other, but John Boehner had a teleprompter, and it said the ayes have it. So despite all the points of order, they ramroded through and said the Maine delegates will not be seated. And then when it came time for the Rules Committee report, they did the exact same thing, only this time it was clear the nays were louder. It was clear. It was absolutely obvious. But the teleprompter again said the ayes have it. And the convention revolted. We realized we were not at an actual convention. We were at a made-for-TV special where the delegates are props and the votes don't matter. So people from states all across the country left, marched out in protest, chanting, "As Maine goes, so goes the nation." And you know what? I can't help but take a little bit of pride knowing that later in that general election, Mitt Romney lost by less than the margin that Ron Paul got in key states because he kicked us in the teeth. He said, we don't want you in this party. And many people said, fine, we're not voting for you. We'll just let Barack Obama win. That's what the Republican Party wanted. They didn't want us. But I kept at it. And I kept thinking about what Obi-Wan Kenobi said, strike me down now, I will rise more powerful than you can possibly imagine. So when the campaign ended, Ron Paul announced his retirement from Congress, and he is no central planner. People kept asking him, Ron Paul, what do? We want to continue on the liberty movement. We want to continue fighting. Tell us what to do. And Ron Paul said, I don't know. You got to figure it out. That's up to you. There's a job out there for you, but it's up to you to find. And so people went out and did many things. Some people pursued agorism. Some people pursued homeschooling. Some people said, we're going to end the Fed by pioneering Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And these days, it seems like they might actually succeed at doing that. But I went a political path. I ran for state senate. I won a state senate seat and served multiple terms, passed constitutional carry, right to try, welfare reform, medical cannabis, a whole bunch of things. I ran 2 federal campaigns. I ended up in the Twitter files when my U.S. Senate opponent went to the Twitter executives to get me censored, and my opponent censored. I kind of feel like, I can't go through it all for the sake of time, but I kind of feel like I've been Forrest Gumping my way through some major historical events the last couple of years. I don't know if anyone can identify with that. But I've been fighting for liberty. I joined the Ron Paul Revolution. I was a soldier of the Ron Paul Revolution, and I still am today. And every single step along the way, I've asked myself, what is the best thing I can do right now to serve the cause of liberty? And after 14 years at this, particularly working in the state of Maine, seeing liberty in my state die a death by a million cuts, it's been hard to ignore that here in New Hampshire, it's been statism that has been dying a death by a million cuts. And it's because of the concentration strategy. And boy, there's so much more to say. This speech went on a lot longer than I planned for. I wish I could keep talking. But I'll just say this. I'm really honored to be able to join the Free State movement. I think that this is our Galt's Gulch. This is our Helm's Deep. This is our granite fortress of freedom. As progressivism and tyranny is on the upswing everywhere else across America, and here in New Hampshire, because of the work of the Free State movement, because of the libertarian concentration strategy, we're actually beating those forces back, and we are establishing a real laboratory for innovation, for actual liberty and community here in New Hampshire. And there's so much more I would say, but I just want to say thank you for listening to these old stories. Thank you for being a part of this fight for liberty. Look, that torch of liberty has been passed down, not just in our American times, but you go back to even the ancients like Cato the Younger passing the torch of liberty down, inspiring our founding generation. Thomas Jefferson inspiring people like Ron Paul, and Ron Paul handing that torch of liberty off to all of us. The revolution is ours now. The revolution is here, and the revolution lives. And it lives here in New Hampshire, and I'm so honored to be beginning this journey with all of you. Thank you very much.